The work of Lady Georgiana Curzon, Lady Chesham, and the Yeomanry Hospital during the war third voyage to the Cape, 1902, Fight the Good Fight. On the pages of history is recorded in golden letters the name and deeds of Florence Nightingale, who, as the pioneer of scientific hospital nursing, did so much to mitigate the horrors of war. Her example was nobly followed half a century later by two other English ladies, who, although they had not to encounter the desperate odds connected with ignorance and old-fashioned ideas, which Miss Nightingale successfully combated, did marvellous service by displaying what private enterprise can do in a national emergency, an emergency with which, in its suddenness, gravity and scope, no government could have hoped to deal successfully. I must go back to the winter of 1899 to call their great work to mind. War had already been waging some weeks in South Africa, when the government's proclamation was issued calling for volunteers from the Yeomanry for active service at the front, and the lightning response that came to this appeal from all quarters and from all grades was the silver lining shining brightly through the black clouds that hovered over the British Empire during that dread winter. Thus the loyalty of the men of Britain was proven, and among the women who yearned to be up and doing were Lady Georgiana Curzon and Lady Chesham. Not theirs was the sentiment that men must work and women must weep. To them it seemed but right that they should take their share of the nation's burden, and as they could not fight, they could and did work. Filled with pity for all who were so gallantly fighting at the seat of war, it was the yeomen called suddenly from peaceful pursuits to serve their country in her day of distress who claimed their deepest sympathies. And with the object of establishing a hospital for this force at the front, Lady Georgiana Curzon and Lady Chesham, on December 29, 1899, appealed to the British public for subscriptions. The result far exceeded their expectations, and every post brought generous donations in cash and in kind. Even the children contributed eagerly to the Yeomen's Fund, and one poor woman gave a shilling towards the cost of providing a bed in the hospital, in case her son might have to lie on it. The Queen then Princess of Wales allowed herself to be nominated President. The present Princess of Wales and the Duchess of Connaught gave their names as Vice-Presidents of the Imperial Yeomanry Hospitals. The working committee was composed of the following: Adeline, Duchess of Bedford, the Duchess of Marlborough, the Countesses of Essex and Dudley, the Ladies Chesham and Tweedmouth, Mesdames S. Newman, A.G. Lucas, Blencow-Cookson, Julius Wernher, now Lady Wernher, and Madame von André. Amongst the gentlemen who gave valuable assistance, the most prominent were Viscount Curzon, MP, now Lord Howe, Hun; Secretary, Mr. Ludwig Newman, Hun; Treasurer, General Eaton, now Lord Chelesmore, and Mr. Oliver Williams. Lady Georgiana Curzon was a born leader, and it was but natural that the capable ladies aforementioned appointed her as their chairman. Passionately devoted to sport though she was, she willingly forsook her beloved hunting field, leaving a stable full of hunters idle at Melton Mowbray, for the committee room and the writing table. The scheme was one fraught with difficulties great and numerous, and not the least amongst them was the red tape that had to be cut. But Lady Georgiana Curzon took up the good cause with enthusiasm and ability, and she and her colleagues worked to such purpose that on March 17, 1900, a base hospital containing over 500 beds, which number was subsequently increased to 1,000, fully equipped, left our shores. So useful did these institutions prove themselves that as time went on, and the evils of war spread to other parts of South Africa, the committee were asked to inaugurate other hospitals, and the funds at their disposal allowing of acquiescence, they established branches at Mackenzie's Farm, Maitland Camp, Eastwood, Elandsfontein and Pretoria, besides a small convalescent home for officers at Johannesburg. Thus in a few months a field hospital and bearer company, the first ever formed by civilians, several base hospitals and a convalescent home were organised by the Imperial Yeomanry Hospitals Committee, who frequently met, with Lady Georgiana Curzon presiding, to discuss ways and means of satisfactorily working those establishments so many thousands of miles away. The hospital commissioners who visited Deelfontein in November 1900 said it was one of the best managed hospitals in Africa. A similar opinion was expressed by Colonel A.G. Lucas, MVO, when he visited it in the autumn, and this gentleman also reported most favourably on the section at Mackenzie's Farm. Through Colonel Kilkelly, Lord Kitchener sent a message to the committee early in 1901, expressing his admiration of the Pretoria Hospital. In this branch Lady Roberts showed much interest, and with her customary kindness, rendered it every assistance in her power. At a time when military hospitals were being weighed in the balance, and in some instances found wanting, the praise bestowed on the yeomanry institutions was worthy of note. From first to last, the various staffs numbered over 1,400 persons, and more than 20,000 patients were treated in the yeomanry hospitals, whilst they were under the management of Lady Georgiana Curzon and her committee. Although sick and wounded from every force under the British flag in South Africa were taken in, and many Boers as well, a sufficient number of beds was always available for the immediate admittance of patients from the force for which the hospitals were originally created. The subscriptions received for this great national work totalled over £145,300, in addition to a subsidy of £3,000 from the government for prolonging the maintenance of the Field Hospital and Bearer Company from January 1 to March 31, 1901. The interest on deposits alone amounted to over £1,635, and when, with the cessation of hostilities, there was, happily, no further need for these institutions, the buildings, etc., were sold for £24,051. The balance which the committee ultimately had in hand from this splendid total of over £174,000 was devoted to the maintenance of a school which had since been established at Perivale Alperton, for the benefit of the daughters of yeomen who were killed or disabled during the war. There has been ample testimony of the excellent way in which this admirable scheme was created and carried out. Numerous letters, touching in their expressions of gratitude, were received from men of all ranks whose sufferings were alleviated in the yeomanry hospitals. Newspapers commented upon it at the time, but it is only those who were behind the scenes that can tell what arduous work it entailed, and of how unflinchingly it was faced by the chairman of the committee. Constant interviews with War Office officials, with doctors, with nurses, the hundreds of letters that had to be written daily, the questions, necessary and unnecessary, that had to be answered, the estimates that had to be examined, would have proved a nightmare to anyone not possessed of the keenest intellect combined with the strongest will. It involved close and unremitting attention from morning till night, and this not for 1 week but for many months, and yet no detail was ever momentarily shirked by one who loved an outdoor life. Lady Georgiana realised to the full the responsibilities of having this vast sum of money entrusted to her by the British public, and not wisely, but too well, did she devote herself to discharging it. Her services to the country were as zealous as they were invaluable. By her quick grasp of the details of administration, by the marvellous tact and skill she exercised, and by the energy she threw into her undertaking, every difficulty was mastered. At this present time, many hundreds of men who were 10 years ago facing a desperate foe can reflect gratefully, if sadly, that they owe their lives to the generous and unselfish efforts of a brave woman who is no longer with us. For after all, Lady Georgiana Curzon was human, and had to pay the price of all she did. Her great exertions seriously told upon her health, as was only to be expected, and long before the conclusion of her strenuous labours she felt their effects, although she ignored them. Lady Chesham was no less energetic a worker, and had as an additional anxiety the fact of her husband and son 42, being both at the front. It was imperative that one of these two ladies, who were responsible for starting the fund, should personally superintend the erection and the opening of the large base hospital at Dealfontein, and as Lady Georgiana Curzon had made herself almost indispensable in London by her adroitness in managing already sorely harassed War Office officials, and in keeping her committee unanimous and contented, it was decided that Lady Chesham should proceed to the scene of the war. My sister gladly gave up this stirring role for the more prosaic, but equally important, work in London, and when I returned home in July 1900, I found her still completely absorbed by her self-imposed task. Already her health was failing, and overtaxed nature was having its revenge. During the next 2 years, in spite of repeated warnings and advice, she gave herself no rest, but all the while she cherished the wish to pay a visit to that continent which had been the theatre of her great enterprise. At length, in August 1902, in the week following the coronation of their Majesties, we sailed together for Cape Town, a sea voyage having been recommended to her in view of her refusal to try any of the foreign health resorts, which might have effected a cure. By the death of her father-in-law, my sister was then Lady Howe, but it will be with her old name of Lady Georgiana Curzon, or Lady Georgie, as she was known to her intimates that the task she achieved will ever be associated. More than 7 years had elapsed since my first visit, and nearly 26 months from the time I had left South Africa in the July following the termination of the Mafeking siege, when I found myself back in the old familiar haunts. Groote Schuur had never looked more lovely than on the sunny September morning when we arrived there from the mail steamer, after a tedious and annoying delay in disembarking of several hours, connected with permits under martial law. This delay was rendered more aggravating by the fact that on the very day of our arrival 43, the same law ceased to exist, and that our ship was the last to have to submit to the ordeal. Many and sad were the changes that had come to pass in the 2 years, and nowhere did they seem more evident than when one crossed the threshold of Mr. Rhodes's home. The central figure, so often referred to in the foregoing pages, was no more, and one soon perceived that the void left by that giant spirit, so inseparably connected with vast enterprises, could never be filled. This was not merely apparent in the silent, echoing house, on the slopes of the mountain he loved so well, in the circle of devoted friends and adherents, who seemed left like sheep without a shepherd, but also in the political arena, in the future prospects of that extensive northern territory which he had practically discovered and opened up. It seemed as if Providence had been very hard in allowing one individual to acquire such vast influence, and to be possessed of so much genius, and then not to permit the half-done task to be accomplished. That this must also have been Mr. Rhodes's reflection was proved by the pathetic words he so often repeated during his last illness. So little done, so much to do. Groote Schuur was outwardly the same as in the old days, and kept up in the way one knew that the great man would have wished. We went for the same rides he used to take. The view was as glorious as ever, the animals were flourishing and increasing in numbers, the old lions gazed placidly down from their roomy cage on a ledge of Table Mountain, the peacocks screamed and plumed themselves, and the herd of zebras grazed in picturesque glades. Nothing was changed there to outward appearances, and one had to go farther afield to see evidences of the dismay caused by the pillar being abruptly broken off. Cape Town itself, I soon noted, was altered by the war almost beyond recognition. From the dull and uninteresting seaport town I remembered it when we came there in 1895, it seemed, 7 years later, one of the busiest cities imaginable with the most enormous street traffic. The pavements were thronged, the shops were crowded, and numerous were the smart, khaki-clad figures, bronzed and